finally. Hi, Granola. Hello. 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 Hi. Hello. Hello. For anyone who's never read Wuthering Heights, it brings to mind like Breaking Bad. What's his name? Walter. You have this very refined estate of thrush-crush. It's hard to say that. Hi everyone, it's me, Jess. Welcome back to my channel. Welcome to another video. This is a really special video. I've been wanting to make this video probably since I started my booktube channel. It's going to be a deep dive into my favorite novel ever. And that would be Wuthering Heights. I don't even have pretty copies of Wuthering Heights. One of my goals is to get a pretty copy one day, but I love these copies. It's not the outside so much as the inside that I fell in love with. But before we get into the story of Wuthering Heights, I wanted to explore a little bit of background about the Bronte sisters, just in case you're watching and you don't know anything about them. You could check out the very first UK vlog I ever made, because we did go to the Bronte parsonage, which is located in this isolated village called Haworth. Hope I'm saying it right, in Yorkshire County. It took us a while to get there, and we wanted to see the moors, you know, we wanted to see the atmosphere, and of course the Bronte house is a museum, so we went to the Bronte Museum and it was amazing. You really were able to get a sense and a feel for these sisters and just the environment that they were in. And I'm going to be talking about this in this video, just how much the moors played this important role in Wuthering Heights and how much the landscape and the environment in which Emily Bronte was writing influenced her. So that was really fun to check out. I highly recommend it, despite it being difficult to get to for anyone who wants to experience it. It was very memorable. My daughter and I will always remember that. She shares my love of Wuthering Heights. So yeah, before we get into the story, let me just tell you a little bit about Emily Bronte and the world that she grew up in. She grew up in this very small village, as I said, surrounded by these moors. So the winters were quite harsh. The weather was gloomy and stormy, probably for much of the time, except for, say, for in the summers. And so it influenced, I think, all of the Bronte sisters, this place where they grew up, but very specifically Emily Bronte and her writing of Wuthering Heights. I think that the landscape really fed into her imagination when she was writing Wuthering Heights. Emily is one of three sisters. Her two sisters, Charlotte and Anne Bronte, also wrote very successful novels. They were writing in the 19th century, and because of this and because they were women, they faced a lot of potential constraints for their work being published. They all published under male pseudonyms. Emily Bronte's pseudonym was Ellis Bell, and Wuthering Heights was published under that pseudonym Ellis Bell in 1847. When the novel was first published, critics were absolutely gobsmacked. They were shocked. They were shocked because the novel is extremely passionate, it's extremely emotionally intense, it's quite violent in places, and it doesn't hold back. The language, the characters, they're screaming, they're fighting. It was something unlike anything that was available to the public at that time. It was nothing like the Victorian novels of its era. They were more genteel. They were more demure, you could say. And Wuthering Heights is very morally ambiguous as well. So for that reason, critics were very perturbed. Oftentimes, Wuthering Heights is presented as a romance novel, but it could be farther. I don't think anything could be farther from the truth. It's really a novel about abuse, and I'm not the first person to say that. So there is a story of romance, but it's a dysfunctional type of a romance. It's an obsessive type of romance. So it's more like passionate obsession. And some of us might see that as romantic, but it's definitely unhealthy. So for me, when I read it, I was still a teenager, and it just I don't know, it just resonated with so much of the intense emotions and feelings that I was having at that stage in my life. So I think not a surprise that Wuthering Heights resonated with a lot of us when we were younger. And my daughter also, I introduced her to Wuthering Heights when she was younger. And I think it resonates with young people for this reason, because when you're young, your feelings are so big and it's so hard to express them and you're so restrained by society. And then you have this book that you have these characters who are just so awful and they're expressing all of these really intense emotions. So this is one of the reasons why I think so many people love Wuthering Heights. Emily's novel really isn't about romance. It's about obsession. It's also about revenge, which is also a fascinating emotion that humans have, or a fascinating motive that humans have that's explored really well in Wuthering Heights. It's also about trauma and identity, and also explores a bit of social class. But really it's the narrative that the readers are pulled into that's so emotionally explosive and intense. It kind of feels like, you know, you're in the middle of some crazy windstorm. It's very enthralling and very exciting, and the characters are so awful, and they're so awful to each other. It's just so compelling. And they're very human characters. Human in terms of our humanness, in terms of exaggerated bad sides of our human character. Let me just lay out the plot for anyone who's never read Wuthering Heights, and I don't think it's too concerning to give spoilers because it's such a well-known book, and you'd want to read it anyway, even if you know some of the plot points. What actually happens in Wuthering Heights? The story itself begins with Mr. Lockwood, who, and it's 20 years after the events. So the events get retold. So it's a story nested within a story. That's the way the narrative is constructed. So he is an outsider to the family, and he's come to rent one of two estates. The more elegant estate, it's called Thrushcross Grange. That very elegant estate is next to an estate that's more sort of in shambles, which is Wuthering Heights. It's more wild, it's a little bit more unkept. Mr. Lockwood comes to this estate and he visits the Heights, and he encounters the world of this family that owns this property. Lockwood learns about the family from Nellie Dean, and Nellie Dean tells him the history of the family. He also has this supernatural experience where there's a ghost knocking on his window, and it's the ghost of one of the main characters, Catherine, and she's trying to be let back in the house, and she writes in fog on the windows her name with different last names, and it really captures your imagination at the beginning of the story. And Nellie Dean, so he goes to Nellie Dean and says like, what I think Kathy says something like, it's been 20 years I've been trying to get in. And so he goes to ask about what is this all about. So we have already set up this third-hand accounting by Nellie, which is unreliable, right? We're looking to the past. We've got an unreliable retelling of the events of the history of this family. Right off the bat, we have this idea that, okay, we're not going to know for sure everything that happened, which leaves the reader to fill in a lot of elements of the story or to question elements of the story. So we're hearing about these characters secondhand. Lockwood is listening to Nellie. Nellie's recalling the events, and that's a really key element to the plot and to the way that the story is organized. It's very non-linear and not reliable, so it can be a little bit confusing for people who are reading it for the first time, and it might be one of the reasons why some people object to Wuthering Heights, along with the characters being so awful and a lot of these other objections, and it not being a soft romantic story. So the result of this is that we rarely get an objective view of the characters and what happened, which makes the story itself a lot more mysterious, and it makes the characters a lot more psychologically complex because we're trying to understand why they say and do the things that they did. We're trying to fill in the blanks. Catherine and her brother Hindley are the son and daughter of Mr. Earnshaw, and their father goes off one day to do business out to the city, and he asks them, what do you want me to bring back? And they are spoiled, and so they're wealthy, and the children are spoiled, and they're asking for things, and in the end he comes back with an orphan boy. The orphan boy is Heathcliff, We don't know anything about where Heathcliff came from. It's presented as if Mr. Earnshaw just found him on the streets and gathered him up and brought him home. So we don't really know very much about him. When he's brought into the home, Catherine and Heathcliff form this bond with each other. And they're inseparable. They just enjoy playing together, and it's like this elemental bond that really can't be broken. But even though he's an orphan, social pressures of the time come into the story, and Catherine ends up marrying the neighbor's son, Edgar Linton, who is the wealthy, refined neighbor, and she rejects Heathcliff. So Heathcliff, completely devastated by the rejection, he disappears, and he's gone for years and years and years. And when he comes back, he's really wealthy, and he's become really hardened and really cruel. And he sets out to exact revenge on really everyone who wronged him, including Catherine's brother Hindley, who was extremely abusive to him when he came into the home, Edgar, who married Catherine, and even the children in the next generation. So in the second half of the story of Wuthering Heights, we hear from the next generation, including one chapter, which is in the voice of Isabella, who Heathcliff actually marries. He's also really horrible to her as well. So it's like a storm of grief, obsession, mess, revenge, unrequited love. Like, it's really intense. So let's talk about Heathcliff a little bit more, because I feel that Emily Bronte did so many things with this novel that really were used afterwards that really hadn't been presented before in this way before, and that a lot of stories now rely on. Not the least of which is the character of Heathcliff, because we love Heathcliff. We actually, when you read the book, you hate, but you also love Heathcliff. So he's like the model of the modern day kind of anti-hero. Like, it brings to mind Walter White from Breaking Bad, for example. Like, he does horrible, horrible things, but we understand why he does those things in the series, and we like him as a character. And I feel like Heathcliff was like the original Walter White. Well, or like in The Talented Mr. Ripley, that's another example where, I mean, maybe not as much, but you know, these characters that are the anti-hero, right? He's horrible. He's violent. He's obsessive. He's totally morally ambiguous, and yet we can't stop thinking about him. So on the one hand, he's the victim, and on the other hand, he's also the villain. He was an orphan. He was abused when he came into the home. He was humiliated. He was marginalized. We don't know his background. We don't know his race. As an adult, as Heathcliff grows up, it's not like those experiences like turn him into like a really generous, compassionate person because he was treated so badly. It's the opposite. For sure, Wuthering Heights is an exploration of the cycle of abuse, which is really one of the reasons why I enjoy the book so much, because I think it's fascinating as an exploration of the cycles of abuse. Heathcliff's character is so complex and so interesting because he chooses cruelty after having been treated so cruelly. And he's manipulative, he manipulates people, he hoards his wealth, and he really focuses his entire life on taking revenge. And his love for Catherine also is so intense and so dysfunctional. It's like it borders on unnatural, like, if I can say that. There are supernatural elements in the story, including ghosts. So it's also this very gothic story, which is another reason why I enjoy it so much. I feel like Heathcliff's character, it was so far ahead of its time. I think the brilliance of the writing in Wuthering Heights and the character development in Wuthering Heights and the choices that Emily Bronte made really blow me away in terms of, like, this was her only novel to ever be published. I wonder sometimes if she had lived what she would have given us, but his character is so dark and so complex and so fascinating. And I feel like you don't get that very often, and especially not from novels of this era. And as you're reading the character of Heathcliff, you can't help but be conflicted. You have this emotional reaction to Heathcliff's character, or at least I did, because sometimes I would be like, how can I like this character when he's so terrible? How can I hate this character when he's experienced so much suffering. So you can't put Heathcliff into the box of good or into the box of evil. And for that reason, he is this morally gray character, which again might be, in terms of complexity, one of the first of its kind in the modern novel. Heathcliff's character in part keeps you reading. It's so compelling. Is he going to at some point become kinder? Is he at some point going to have peace? Like, is he going to be able to rest? And the same thing is true for Catherine Earnshaw, although Cathy does die around the middle of the novel. But she's equally fascinating, right? Because she's also like this spoiled brat. She's terrible. She goes off and marries someone else when she's in love with Heathcliff for social respectability, which you can sort of understand, but you're also completely frustrated with. She's wild and she's passionate and she's constantly torn between Heathcliff and doing what's right and respectable in marrying Edgar. Her very famous line, "I am Heathcliff," gives us some insight into the parallels between their two characters. They really are two sides of the same coin. It's a statement of identity as much as it is about love. They're completely intertwined psychologically, spiritually, and even emotionally. There is that part of Catherine's identity, and then there's the part of Catherine's identity that is the embodiment of the Victorian woman who's constrained by class, society, and those expectations. That's what drives her decision to marry Edgar and to reject Heathcliff, and that sets off the chain of tragedy that drives most of the rest of the novel. She's not perfect. We can't just admire her because she's very imperfect. She's very intensely human. She's constantly throwing fits, getting upset and screaming and yelling. She and Heathcliff fight. It's brutal. It's absolutely brutal. But as I said, she identifies as Heathcliff, and she says quite famously, the quite famous quote from the novel is, "Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same." In terms of the narrative style and the idea that this novel was so unique and so different from anything that was being published at the time, it's what we would call today psychological realism, but back then there wasn't really the terminology for it. So in that way, this story, Wuthering Heights, was really revolutionary. You have multiple narrators, you have a nonlinear structure, you have a nested story, unreliable perspectives that make us question really every event that happens. You're relying on Nellie's memory, probably her bias and her subjectivity that shape the story. The term psychological realism is the idea that we get a lot of perspective from the characters' inner lives, their fears and their desires and their obsessions. And that's exactly what we're given in Wuthering Heights. And it's their inner lives that really drive the plot, which is weird because it's not coming from them. It's coming from another narrator. I don't know how she did it, but she does it really well. Yeah, this is just such a special book. And it's not special because it's sweet or something. It's special because it's just so riveting and so real. All this to say that trauma isn't the backstory. Trauma is internal to each of the character. Their internalized responses to their trauma and then their outward expressions and behaviors as a result. And so the trauma really shapes their choices. It shapes their acts, including acts of revenge, and it perpetuates that cycle of abuse and violence that is such a main theme in Wuthering Heights. We have to think when we're reading Wuthering Heights, whose version of the story can we trust? How can we trust our perception that's formed of Heathcliff and Catherine, and how do those perceptions change? Because they do go back and forth, and that really makes this novel one that's kind of timeless in a very specific way. Like, you know, you could reread this. I've reread this novel now twice, but I feel like I could read it again and capture new things about the characters. Let me talk about the big themes of Wuthering Heights. This is definitely a deep dive video. The themes I'm going to talk about are some that I've already talked about a little bit, so I'll just go over them again. Love and obsession, revenge and violence, nature versus civilization, so the contrast between the Wuthering Heights household and the Thrushcross Grange household, social class as well, identity and psychological meaning for the characters, and then death and the supernatural. First, the idea of love and obsession. In Wuthering Heights, love is really portrayed as all-consuming and extremely destructive. Even if it's like a gentle love or well-meaning love, or redemptive love. And specifically, the relationship between Heathcliff and Catherine really goes beyond what the social norms were of the time. It goes beyond reason. It's obsessive and destructive, and it causes so much suffering to themselves and to others. And you wonder if they're in control of this at all. Not just to do with their personalities, but you get this sense that there's some kind of destiny associated with this type of love. So even though Cathy chooses to marry Edgar for the social stability that he offers, she admits that she is Heathcliff and that his and her souls are intertwined, and that Heathcliff is really inseparable from her identity as a person. And this becomes extremely destructive because it means that she can't really commit to this marriage with Edgar. She's terribly unhappy, and so her life really goes nowhere. I mean, she's very, very unhappy, and then eventually she dies. And on the flip side, Heathcliff's love is obsessive, and then he gets vengeful after she marries Edgar. Emily Bronte is really saying in Wuthering Heights that love, when it's tied up in when it's driven by obsession and passion and ego, it can turn very toxic. So what Emily Bronte seems to be saying about love is that love has this dark side to it, that it can be ego-driven, it can be obsession, passion, but it can also be narcissistic. Like, a lot of people think of Cathy and Heathcliff as very narcissistic characters, which is something else that I won't spend as much time on, but I think is part of their love story. And then we have the theme of revenge and violence. So of course, Heathcliff's life shows how trauma perpetuates the cycle of violence and cruelty. Because he was abused early in his life by Hindley, Catherine's brother, this later fuels his vindictiveness, and it extends into the second generation as well, because he's extremely cruel to Isabella, his wife. What happens is that Heathcliff buys Wuthering Heights. He then humiliates Hindley as a form of revenge. He marries Isabella only to torment her, and ultimately he manipulates the two younger children in the new generation, Hareton and young Cathy. The violence in this novel isn't just physical, although there are scenes of physical violence. It's very psychological, very emotional, and it's intergenerational, which I think, just if you think about that, how many books were thinking about or exploring intergenerational trauma in the 1800s? Like, I don't think any. So Heathcliff just becomes kind of this living embodiment of trauma, showing how when it's unresolved, that kind of hurt and pain can metastasize into these cycles of violence and vengeance. Bronte isn't really glorifying revenge in this novel. She's exploring the destructive costs of such harm and such abuse, and the destructive costs of revenge. And so even, because in the story, even when Heathcliff achieves his revenge, like he gets his revenge in the end, he is completely hollowed out. He's completely haunted by Cathy. It just demonstrates that cruelty never really gives you anything but more cruelty and more pain. I think that's a hugely important message of Wuthering Heights. The nature versus civilization aspect of the landscape and the moors and the two estates. So you have this very refined estate in Thrushcross Grange, and you have this wild, untamed Wuthering Heights. You can think of those as setting a mirror to these two different kinds of emotional states of being. The moors represent as well nature and freedom and this raw passion. And Catherine and Heathcliff spend a lot of time roaming the moors together as children and then later on as adults. So it represents this space where none of the rules of the adults apply, none of the rules of society apply. They can be fully and truly themselves. And then you have the Thrushcross Grange estate that represents order, it represents civility, and it represents the social expectations of the time. Edgar as a character, and even Linton's, and all of the Lintons really embody this civilized restraint. It's a commentary on society and social restraints and even class, in the sense that your natural emotional state, if it's denied, because their emotions are elemental to us as human beings, they can't really be contained by these social norms, or at least not for everyone. So as a civilization, we try to impose these structures on behavior, and we try to snuff out people's obsessions, their passions, and that those emotions are really an unstoppable force in human nature, and that you can't really tame them. So there's this element of the taming of emotions, kind of like Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew comes to mind, but I think that's what she's saying. And of course, these class tensions are very central to the novel as well. Catherine, of course, marries Edgar Linton, and she does it for wealth and social security. And so she's not able to pursue the love that she has for Heathcliff, like, you know, social constraints or social class and security trumps love in this story. The other example of social class in the novel is Heathcliff's story about how he rises in wealth and power despite being orphaned and mistreated when he's younger. And then eventually when he has that wealth, it allows him to enact this revenge. So money and power, when we follow Heathcliff's narrative arc, show us that when you have money and status, you can use that power to your advantage. It's easier to be cruel to others. You have that status. Heathcliff only has that status because he was adopted into the family by Mr. Earnshaw. So he wouldn't have had that ability to enact his revenge or achieve that wealth without that empowerment of social status. These are examples of how Emily Bronte, despite writing this very dramatic novel, was also using it to critique the Victorian class structure of the time, also exploring or trying to explore how class intersects with identity and power, and ultimately revenge as well. And in terms of identity and psychological depth, I already talked about psychological realism a little earlier. The characters' inner conflicts really define them more than these social norms or any of the external events or the events of the plot. Her exploration of identity is really, really remarkably modern for the time that she was writing in. You have Heathcliff, who's torn between love and vengeance, but ultimately he defines himself through his love for Catherine and his connection to her. And then you have Catherine, who's torn between these societal expectations and security and her base desire and passion for Heathcliff. The characters' thoughts, their memories, their obsession really drives the plot as much as their actions do in this story. It's not about what happens. It's about how the characters perceive, interpret, and internalize the events that they experience. And so Bronte is really using this super intense interiority to look at how identity forms when it's in relation to somebody else or one other person, and to trauma. So I just feel like that's so modern, like that anticipates so many of the novels that I read today. Like that's so elementary in the books that I enjoy and love today. They're often about characters who are struggling with their identity, they're struggling with their internal emotions and their turmoil. And I just think most modern novels have probably benefited from this kind of character development and exploration in Wuthering Heights. The last theme that I'm going to talk about is death and the supernatural. If you like Gothic novels, if you like horror, if you like anything having to do with ghosts, it's an added bonus when reading Wuthering Heights, because death in Wuthering Heights, it's not final, right? When Kathy dies, she doesn't actually die. And so the ghost of Kathy is still with us, even at the opening of the book, in what would have been current times. And this idea of like a greater force of love between Heathcliff and Kathy is this kind of supernatural amplification of those themes, of that theme of enduring love between the two of them and the obsession between the two of them. So Kathy's ghost literally haunts the moors. She haunts Lockwood. The symbolism surrounding the ghost of Kathy is the idea that you can never completely separate her from Heathcliff, that she will never leave him, that she will never let him go. Heathcliff, on the same token, has this obsession with being reunited with Kathy when he dies. All of this show that their obsession for each other, their passion for each other, their love for each other transcends this mortal coil, like their mortal existence. It's not just a showpiece for the novel in terms of its Gothic elements. The ghosts actually play a part in the identity of the characters and their unresolved narratives. The ghost and the supernatural actually reflect these emotional truths. They embody this unresolved, unrequited passion or love, the trauma that remains, and the weight of the grief and the longing of these characters. As a fan, I will say that I think, because the novel was so shocking to Victorian readers of its time, and because it's been embraced by readers over time, it has really become a cultural touchstone. It influenced so many other works of fiction, the anti-hero character, the way of representing inner worlds and psychology, or psychological realism in literature. It's undeniable the mark that it's left and its legacy. I'm just going to talk about adaptations because we do have an adaptation of Wuthering Heights upcoming, and I want to make a few comments about it. And it's tied to what I just said about the legacy of the novel. There have been many, many film adaptations. Film, television, you have Kate Bush's Wuthering Heights that tries to capture this intensity in a different medium. So those themes of obsession, love, revenge are great themes that are interesting and that stand the test of time. So that's really why Wuthering Heights stays with us, has this staying power, haunts all of us. So it's a very rare novel. It doesn't leave you alone. It's not merely like the story of star-crossed lovers. It's like the dark and stormy exploration of all of these ideas. And the elemental forces that shape us as human beings. So even now, after over 170 years after it was first published, it's still captivating readers like myself and readers who are coming to it for their first time, because Emily Bronte had the courage to really make a piece of art, a piece of writing that defied all of the norms of the time in terms of the psychology of the characters, in terms of the socially acceptable themes in novels, and the narrative itself. I'm going to get into why I think it's impossible to make a really good adaptation of Wuthering Heights. And I'm sure that people will have other opinions, so please sound off in the comment section below what you think. I think that while a film can bring visuals and music and atmosphere to life, I think the book itself, particularly based on what I've just talked about, has qualities that are almost impossible to fully capture on a screen. Here's why I think that Wuthering Heights is better as a reading experience than it would be as a viewing experience. So the first is the very complicated narrative structure. I think that probably most adaptations will have to abandon the structure, or if they are going to follow the narrative structure, they're going to have to do it in a way that gives a nod to the reader who's already read Wuthering Heights. You have Lockwood being visited by Kathy's ghost and Nellie Dean telling the story from different perspectives. Sometimes you have to question what's real and what's exaggerated because of that. And that's what contributes to the psychological depth and to the mystery of the novel. So I think that a movie would not be able to capture that complexity. It would have to simplify this no matter what decisions were made by a director. They would have to straighten out the timeline, and they would have to streamline the narration to make it easier for the viewer to follow. And I think in that way they would lose a lot of the layered effect of the narrative storytelling and the way that the book was originally organized. And that would take away from the mystery and the haunting aspects of the book. Remember, it's a these characters are dead. Well, Kathy's dead. So the characters are telling this from beyond the grave, or Kathy is anyway. So that's something that would be very difficult to capture in a film, no matter what you did. And that leads me to the depth of the characters. I don't think that for such a psychologically complex book, there's any way that you could capture the level of inner turmoil that we get by reading about these characters, their contradictions, their obsessions. I don't think that that could be completely conveyed in a film. And I think that as for this upcoming adaptation, which I'll talk about specifically in a few minutes, I think that their characters are going to be reduced to these romanticized lovers, or in the case of Heathcliff, maybe a melodramatic villain. As well as Kathy, she might be presented as sort of hysterical. I'm not sure, but it's hard to take something that's that psychologically complex and put it on the screen into these characters that, although Heathcliff might be brooding, a brooding anti-hero on screen, you're not going to get access to the reasons for him being a brooding guy, like all of the trauma and the psychological torment that we know he experiences from having read the book. And then in the same vein, you're not going to be able to capture the emotional intensity that you can capture when you're reading the novel. It's just because of the raw elemental emotion that you can write on the page. I think if you tried to put that on a screen, it would become horrific. And it is horrific to read it, but to show this all in visuals, I think the storms that are happening in these characters and between them and the fights, I think that that would be really difficult to translate. I don't know how you would translate their destructive love onto the screen, because the novel has us living in their minds, and that's just a lot more affecting than anything you would be able to watch unfold on the screen. And I just think that the themes that I talked about in this video will be a lot harder to capture. And those themes are woven into the narrative and the dialogue and the inner monologues. And the film will have to choose what it wants to emphasize. Maybe it's going to emphasize the atmospheric elements of Wuthering Heights, or maybe it's going to emphasize the social class distinctions, or maybe it's going to emphasize the love story. You also would have difficulty being able to, I mean, Wuthering Heights, this book thrives on ambiguity. So again, I don't know. You have like ghostly apparitions, you have your unreliable narrators, you have your morally gray characters, and our readers engaged actively in sorting through all of that. They're interpreting the characters' motives, they're interpreting the events that happen in the story from various different characters' viewpoints. And I just don't think you can replicate that in a film, because a film projects like a fixed vision of the story. So that would be a limitation on any kind of adaptation. And the last reason why I think the adaptation would be lesser than the story is because Emily Bronte's writing is extremely intense. It's very poetic. It's very gripping. Her descriptions of the moors, the dialogue, they all carry this kind of rhythm and metaphor and emotion that I don't think a film would be able to fully reproduce. The bottom line for me is that a movie might be really fun and it might capture elements of the story, but it will never be able to live in your heart and your mind the same way that the novel would. It's just an experience that I think is irreplaceable. So as we know, in February, there is going to be the release of an adaptation of Wuthering Heights, directed by Emerald Fennell and starring Margot Robbie and Jacob Elordi. I'm just going to talk about what I think, in addition to the things that I've said, are going to be problematic with this adaptation. So far, the casting decisions seem to be off. I mean, I don't want to comment too much on the race, but Heathcliff is described as, in the novel, as having dark hair, dark skin, and being an outsider. He could possibly be of Romani descent. We're hinted to that in the novel. And Jacob Elordi is white, and so it suggests this kind of whitewashing of this character who is supposed to have an element of otherness. Margot Robbie as Catherine Earnshaw is older than what Kathy in the book is meant to be. She's in her 30s, so that's quite a bit older than the depiction of Kathy in the book. So this just gives us kind of a broader concern that they might choose then to be diluting class tensions and possibly racial tensions, which for sure class tensions were central to the novel's themes, and the outsider status of Heathcliff and his social exclusion may be completely eliminated from this adaptation, which would completely take away from the original story. I've seen the trailer, and the style and sexualization in the trailer, it's so stylized and it's very sexually provocative. It has this kind of 50 Shades of Grey vibe to it, which is completely different from the novel. So I'm concerned that the depth of the abuse and trauma and the emotional cruelty that's captured in Wuthering Heights is going to be overshadowed by more of this kind of erotic imagery around the relationship between Catherine and Heathcliff. And because they're using Charlie XCX for the score, I think it's just going to be maybe a little bit modernized in a way that doesn't actually represent the themes of the novel. So it just seems like it might not be authentic to the source material. It just doesn't seem, from what I've seen of the trailer, it doesn't reflect the tone of the novel. I've heard that it only focuses on the first half of the novel and that it might even end before Catherine dies, which would also be, well, it would just be an inaccurate representation, at least in terms of what the novel's actually about, and especially when it has to do with Heathcliff's character. Like, I'm wondering how complex Heathcliff's character is going to be in this film representation. I think the casting director was quoted as saying, "You really don't need to be accurate, it's just a book," and that has upset a lot of people, especially those of us who are very faithful to the literary masterpiece that is Wuthering Heights. It's also coming out on Valentine's Day. Like, doesn't that sit weird with people? It sits weird with me. It really does. It just seems like they're taking the story and they're turning it into something that it wasn't originally meant to be. And that makes me sad. If you love the novel for its emotional intensity, its moral complexity, this class and outsider theme, you're going to feel potentially really alienated by the film because it seems like it's a more eroticized, stylized, modern interpretation. If you're open to that kind of a reinterpretation that takes a lot of creative liberties, then you might really enjoy it. So all of this to say, this book matters. It matters a lot to me. It still matters in the world of literature. It still matters to new readers. And I hope that the film will bring people to the book if they haven't read the book. I hope this video will bring you to the book if you haven't already read the book. This book is completely uncompromising in terms of its representation of a completely over-the-top, emotionally charged relationship between Heathcliff and Kathy and their ideas about love and themselves. And it's full of beauty as well as cruelty, as well as love, as well as passion and revenge. It's so messy and it's so dark and it's so deeply human. And that's exactly why I love it so much. So thank you so much for watching this. If you didn't know that Wuthering Heights was my favorite book, now you know. Read it. Read it. I'm sure you can get a used copy very easily of Wuthering Heights. I will see you in my next video. Bye for now. So Kathy's ghost, so he's like the model of the modern day anti-hero. No, don't bark. Catherine and Heathcliff form a youth. Emily's story isn't really about romance, as I just. So you could watch my.